Most ancient humans never crossed a continent, and yet somehow their descendants reached every habitable corner of Earth. The mystery gets stranger. They did it without roads, engines, or any written map showing them where the world ended. So what was moving across the planet? People? Or something more powerful than people? When we picture ancient migration, we often imagine a determined group standing at the edge of Africa, pointing toward a distant horizon, then beginning one heroic journey into the unknown. No family woke up one morning and decided to walk from East Africa to Australia. Most people probably lived, hunted, raised children, and died within a region they knew well. The journey happened across generations. A group followed animals toward better grazing land. Another moved when a river changed course. Another left because a dry season lasted too long, local plants failed, or too many families were competing for the same hunting ground. One move may have been only a few miles, but a few miles repeated by thousands of families across thousands of years can redraw the human map. I think this is the first idea we have to understand. Humanity traveled farther than most individual humans ever did, and the force pushing that movement was not adventure. It was survival. Food moved, so people moved. Herds followed rain. Fruit appeared and vanished with the seasons. Coastlines offered shellfish, fish, birds, and fresh water, until they did not. Ancient migration was not a straight line on a map. It was more like a living edge, slowly expanding, retreating, splitting, and expanding again. But here is where the story becomes more impressive. Walking far is not the same as surviving far from home. The human body helped. We walk on two legs with remarkable energy efficiency at moderate speeds. We cool ourselves through sweating, and when people grow up walking daily, distances that sound extreme to modern city dwellers can become routine. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer and traditional walking societies show that people may cover roughly 10 to 20 miles in a day, sometimes while carrying food, tools, or children. A person can walk 20 miles in the wrong direction and die faster. The real technology was knowledge. Where does water collect after rain? Which birds fly toward rivers at sunset? What kind of green vegetation can survive above hidden groundwater? When do animals begin moving before a storm? Which valley becomes a flood channel in spring? To us, a landscape may look empty. To an experienced traveler, it is full of signs. A broken branch, fresh tracks, the taste of dust in the wind, a line of trees where no river is visible. These were not random tricks discovered by one clever hunter. They were observations gathered over generations, tested by hunger, corrected by failure, and passed through stories, imitation, and memory. That changes the way I see ancient travel. The most important map was not drawn on skin, wood, or stone. It was carried inside the group, and that map included more than directions. It contained warnings. Do not cross that plain after the rains. Do not drink from that pool in the hot season. Follow these stars until the mountains shift to your left. Wait for the herds. Leave before the cold closes the pass. But even perfect knowledge could not make every route possible. Sometimes geography had to change first. During colder periods, enormous amounts of water were locked in ice sheets. Global sea level fell, exposing land that is underwater today. One famous example was Beringia, the broad region that once connected northeastern Asia and Alaska. We often call it a land bridge, but that phrase creates the wrong picture. It was not a narrow strip of dirt hanging over the sea. At times, it was a vast inhabited landscape with plants, animals, rivers, and enough space for human populations to live and move across. People did not necessarily realize they were entering a new continent. There was no border sign, no dramatic moment when Asia ended and America began. They followed resources across ordinary ground that later disappeared beneath the ocean. Something similar may have happened near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait between the Horn of Africa and Arabia. During periods of lower sea level, the crossing was narrower than today, making movement between Africa and Southwest Asia more possible. This reveals a pattern we still see in human history. People rarely defeat geography through courage alone. They study it. They wait for openings. They move when climate, water, animals, and season briefly align. But now we reach the point where walking can no longer explain the evidence. Australia was never fully connected to Southeast Asia by dry land, even when sea levels were far lower. At some point, tens of thousands of years ago, people stood at the edge of water, looked toward a horizon with no visible promise, and left the land anyway. So the next question is not how far ancient humans could walk. It is why they were willing to sail toward a place they could not yet see. They left the shore anyway. That decision changed human history. Once people stepped onto a raft, canoe, or early watercraft, they were no longer following a trail. They were entering a world where the trail disappeared beneath them. No footprints. No trees, no riverbank to guide the eye. Only wind, waves, distance, and the possibility that nothing waited beyond the horizon. What I find most revealing is that reaching Australia required more than courage. Even when sea levels were lower, deep water gaps still separated Southeast Asia from Australia and New Guinea. Archaeological evidence suggests humans were present in Australia at least 65,000 years ago. That means someone had to cross open water. Not once by accident, but enough times for a population to survive and spread. And that creates a problem for the image of helpless castaways drifting wherever the sea carried them. A single person might drift, but a population requires planning. It requires tools, food, water, and enough people with enough skills to begin again. The oldest boats used materials that rarely survive. Wood rots, fiber disappears, bark breaks down, so archaeology cannot show us exactly what those vessels looked like. But absence of a preserved boat is not absence of a voyage. The people arrived. The water was in the way. Before a successful crossing, someone had to believe land might exist beyond sight. Maybe they watched birds fly out in the morning and return at dusk. Maybe storms carried branches or seeds toward shore. Maybe clouds formed over land hidden below the horizon. We do not know the exact clue, but we know they acted on it. That is a different kind of intelligence. It is the ability to turn incomplete evidence into a decision. Thousands of years later, Pacific voyagers refined that ability into a sophisticated navigation tradition. Polynesian navigators crossed enormous stretches of ocean in double-hulled canoes and outrigger vessels. They did not rely on written charts. Their maps were stored in memory and observation. They read the rising and setting points of stars. They studied ocean swells. They watched cloud shape, watercolor, floating plants, and seabirds. An island too distant to see could still disturb the sea around it. Waves bending around unseen land left patterns that a trained navigator could feel through the hull. Imagine that, roar. The ocean looks empty to everyone else. But beneath the canoe, the water is already carrying news of land. This is why I do not think we should call these voyagers primitive sailors. Their instruments were different from ours, but the thinking was precise. They observed, they compared, they memorized, they corrected mistakes. And they taught the next navigator to notice what an untrained person would miss. But finding an island was only the first challenge. The harder question was whether people could stay alive after they arrived. A canoe landing on a beach is an event. A community surviving there for generations is a system. That is why planned voyaging can be recognized through what people carried. Not only tools, but plants, animals, seeds, and supplies needed to create food after landing. A founding population had to think beyond the journey. They needed fresh water, crops, breeding animals, fishing knowledge, shelter skills, and enough cooperation to survive storms, hunger, injury, and conflict. They were not just transporting bodies. They were transporting a culture. They were carrying a small, living version of home across the sea. This changes the meaning of exploration. We often celebrate the person who first sees new land. But seeing land is not the same as understanding it. A beach can look safe and still have no reliable water. A green island can hide poor soil. A calm lagoon can become deadly during a seasonal storm. The real achievement was learning the island quickly enough that children could survive there. And children change everything. A migration involving families cannot depend on luck alone. It must include care, food planning, shelter, knowledge, and trust. This is why the presence of women, children, crops, and animals matters. It tells us the goal was not adventure. The goal was continuity. A boat can reach an island. Only a culture can turn that island into a home. And even the greatest navigators were not guaranteed success. Some voyages almost certainly vanished without leaving a trace. A storm could split a canoe. A current could pull travelers off course. Water could run out before land appeared. The successful routes are remembered because descendants survived to remember them. The failed routes disappeared into the ocean. Ancient travel was not a smooth march of progress. It was a long conversation between hope and danger, between what people knew and what they were willing to risk before they knew enough. By the time humans settled remote islands, distance had become more than empty space. It had become a test of memory, cooperation, and belief. But the sea was only one barrier. Across deserts, frozen plains, mountain passes, and river systems, humans faced a different problem. Not how to find land, but how to carry enough life with them to cross it. Carrying enough life across land created a different problem. A family could walk for days, but food, water, tools, children, and shelter materials had weight. That weight placed a hard limit on distance. At first, humans worked with the landscape instead of fighting it. Rivers became natural corridors. They offered drinking water, fish, fertile banks, and a route easier to follow than dense forest or broken mountains. Once boats improved, rivers became something more powerful. They became highways. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Indus moved people, goods, and ideas long before paved roads existed. A traveler following a river did not need to memorize every turn. The water itself pointed forward. But rivers could not reach everywhere. So humans changed the equation by sharing the burden with animals. Horses, donkeys, camels, and llamas did more than make travel faster. They expanded the amount of life a group could carry. More food, more water, more tools, more time before a journey became desperate. What I find most important is that domestication turned movement into logistics. A strong animal alone was not enough. People had to learn feeding, breeding, training, loading, and balance. They had to understand how much weight an animal could carry, when it needed rest, and which terrain would damage its feet. That knowledge mattered as much as the animal. Camels show this clearly. Their bodies are adapted for heat, dry air, and long periods with limited water. But their impact grew when people developed saddles that could secure riders and cargo without injuring the animal. That design helped open routes across the Sahara, Arabia, and parts of Central Asia. A saddle is not as dramatic as a ship crossing an ocean. Yet without it, entire trade systems might have remained far smaller. This is one of the quiet patterns of ancient history. A major change often begins with a practical solution that looks ordinary. But then the environment changes again. In the Arctic and subarctic, pack animals were not always the answer. Deep snow and ice could make loaded walking slow and dangerous. So people developed sleds, often pulled by dogs bred and trained for endurance. The sled spread weight across the surface instead of forcing every step downward. It turned frozen ground from an obstacle into a road. That is the paradox. The same landscape that could kill an unprepared traveler could become a transportation system for someone who understood it. Deserts demanded a different solution. There, the main question was not speed. It was water. Ancient travelers used treated animal skins, gourds, and later ceramic containers to carry it. But containers alone could not guarantee survival. People also had to know where water might be found. A spring hidden behind rock, a seasonal pool, a well known only to local families, a line of vegetation marking moisture beneath the ground. In dry country, memory could be more valuable than cargo. One forgotten water source could end a journey. One remembered location could save a group. And this is where distance began to depend on relationships. No traveler could personally know every river crossing, mountain pass, or desert well. So information moved between communities. A hunter described a safe valley. A trader warned of a blocked pass. A family offered shelter. A guide knew which well held water. Before roads connected settlements, trust connected them. That trust also allowed objects to travel farther than the people who owned them. Archaeologists have found stone, shell, pigments, and other materials hundreds or even thousands of miles from their original source. That does not mean one traveler carried each object from beginning to end. Many probably moved through chains of exchange. One community traded with another. That group carried the object farther. Then someone else moved it again. A piece of stone could cross a continent through dozens of hands. Ancient trade created a network without a central planner. No one needed to understand the whole route. Each person only needed to know the next connection. But every network had weak points. A failed harvest could close a route. Conflict could make the valley unsafe. Disease could spread through the same contacts that carried goods. A guide could misjudge the weather. A water source could disappear. And some groups never arrived. We should not confuse survival with certainty. The archaeological record is shaped by journeys that succeeded. The people who died in a storm, vanished in a desert, or froze on a pass often left little behind. Their silence can make the past look more orderly than it was. I think that is the hardest truth in this story. Human expansion was not a clean line moving forward. It was a web of attempts. Some routes opened, some collapsed. Some knowledge survived because a traveler returned to share it. Other lessons may have disappeared with the last person who knew them. And that brings us to the deepest question. If ancient people had no libraries, printed maps, or permanent scientific institutions, how did knowledge survive long enough to guide people who had not even been born yet? It survived because knowledge was never stored in one place. It lived in people. An elder remembered where the river changed after a flood. A hunter knew which tracks meant danger. A mother knew which roots could be eaten and which had to be soaked, crushed, or cooked first. A boat builder remembered how much curve a hull needed before it could survive heavy waves. A navigator carried the night sky in his mind. Each person held only part of the system. Together, the community became a library. And unlike a library, this one had to be performed. Knowledge had to be repeated in stories, demonstrated with the hands, practiced by children, corrected in public, tested against weather, hunger, distance, and time. If a lesson was forgotten, the cost could be immediate. That pressure made oral knowledge far more precise than many people assume. A story about a dangerous crossing was not entertainment alone. A song about stars could also be a navigation tool. A seasonal ceremony might preserve the correct time to move, hunt, plant, or return. Memory was tied to rhythm, landscape, family, and repetition because survival depended on it. What strikes me most is that ancient people did not separate education from life. Learning was not something children did before becoming useful. Learning was how they became useful. They watched adults read clouds, repair tools, divide food, calm animals, and choose routes. Then they copied those actions until skill replaced instruction. This is how knowledge crossed generations, not perfectly, not without loss, but often well enough to carry people into environments their grandparents had never seen. Modern science now helps us trace parts of that movement. Archaeologists study tools, campsites, bones, and seeds. Climate researchers reconstruct coastlines and rainfall patterns. Geneticists compare inherited markers across populations to estimate where groups separated, mixed, and moved. No single method gives us a complete map. DNA cannot tell us what a traveler felt when land disappeared behind the canoe. A stone tool cannot explain the argument before a group chose one valley over another. A buried campsite cannot preserve every failed route. But when different forms of evidence point in the same direction, the outline becomes clearer. Human beings did not spread because they possessed one perfect invention. They spread because they built systems that could absorb mistakes. A route failed, so another was tried. A boat broke, so its design changed. A water source vanished, so the warning became part of memory. A group survived winter, and the method was taught. To me, that may be the greatest human advantage of all. Not intelligence by itself, not courage by itself, not even cooperation by itself. It was the ability to turn experience into instruction. That ability allowed the dead to keep helping the living. Someone who discovered a safe pass could guide travelers centuries later through a story. Someone who misjudged a season could save future families if the failure was remembered. Someone who noticed how waves changed near an island could teach a child to find land beyond the horizon. Ancient travel was therefore never only about movement through space. It was movement through memory. The body carried supplies. The group carried knowledge. And knowledge carried the future. This also changes the way we should think about progress today. We often celebrate the first person to reach a summit, cross an ocean, or enter unknown territory. But discovery is only the beginning. A path becomes valuable when others can follow it safely. A lesson becomes powerful when it survives the person who learned it. A society becomes resilient when it does not force every generation to make the same mistakes again. That is the deeper lesson hidden inside ancient migration. Humanity did not reach the world because every traveler was fearless. They reached it because communities learned when to be brave, when to wait, when to turn back, and what to teach the people who came next. So how did ancient humans travel so far? They used feet, rivers, boats, animals, stars, seasons, and trade. But beneath all of those tools was something even more important. A chain of memory linking people who would never meet. One generation noticed. The next remembered. The next improved. And eventually a child was born on the far side of a desert, an ocean, or an ice field that no ancestor had once known how to cross. That child called the new place home. Now I want to know what you think. Which mattered more in humanity's expansion? Physical endurance, technology, cooperation, or memory? And if our ancestors could preserve life-saving knowledge without writing, what are we failing to pass on today despite having more ways to record information than any generation before us? Share your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories that uncover the hidden intelligence, risks, and decisions behind ancient human survival, subscribe to the channel. Because the past was not built by primitive people waiting for the modern world. It was built by minds learning, adapting, and leaving a trail of knowledge for us to follow.